Welcome back. I am John P. Today we are going to be talking about Rolex watches and how some of these watches are not going to be able to be serviced by the Rolex Service Center. Yes, that's right. Can you believe it? Your $10,000 Rolex watch, Rolex may actually refuse the repair or service on. Imagine that you have a Rolex watch, you're unscrewing the crown, and the crown falls off, you lose it, it falls under your couch, it gets vacuumed up, who knows where it is. You send it into the service center, expecting a hefty price tag on the repair, and Rolex just says, we don't have the part. That's happening today, and I want to talk about it. Now, I don't want to criticize them, because I think companies have to draw the line, right, somewhere on the repair of products. You wouldn't expect Apple to repair a 10-year-old iPhone. Well, how could you expect Rolex to repair an 80-year-old watch? The parts aren't available. So I do understand it, and I do own vintage Rolex watches as well as modern watches. So I don't want to say that it sways my decision too much, but it may for you, and I want to share that with you. On the wrist today, I have a vintage IWC Ingenieur 666. I love this watch. Very cool, simple, classic watch. And I think that's why, using that as a segue, I think that's why so many people are drawn to the Rolex brands, the Rolex watches. Simple, classic, rugged, durable, and timeless. And that's something that we all know to be Rolex, right? You buy a Datejust 50 years ago, it looks kind of like a Datejust today, right? It's got the same functions, pretty much more or less the same watch, quality different movement, different components, but overall, to the untrained eye, it's the same watch. I know I'm going to get roasted in the comments below, but you get the picture. That's what they're known for. On their website, all the literature, our watches are made to stand the test of time, just so long as it doesn't break or you lose a piece or the crystal gets cracked. Now, if you're not familiar, within the last couple of years, Rolex has stopped making the parts for the 15XX series movements. This is the movement that was used in versions of the Submariner all the way until about the year 1990. Movements unveiled in the year 1960, used for decades, millions of Rolex watches in circulation with this movement, they stopped producing the movement. So there have been collectors that have received, their quotes from the service center thinking, oh, well, everything's keeping great time. I just want a tune-up. I just want my cleaning and service. Rolex, as you know, makes everything to manufacturer spec. When you send it into service, they're not sending it back to you unless it's manufacturer spec. For the most part, special interest watches go through a different queue, but you get the picture. Watches coming back from service, they want to meet their rigid specifications, much like a lot of companies do today, but they do that, and that's also what they're known for. But now collectors are receiving not an expensive bill, right? They were anticipating an expensive bill, but instead just a refusal saying, we don't have the parts for this. Depends on what the part is, but you get the idea. Rolex doesn't have movement parts. If they can't, if they deem a part to be worn down, it might still keep okay time, but if it doesn't meet their specs, they're not going to touch the watch for some other reason. Now, let's say you damage your crystal. We've had accounts, and I've heard of people recently that I know and trust that have had watches with cracked crystals, send them into Rolex. Rolex did not have the plastic crystal available at the service center at that time for that watch. Perhaps they needed some other work on the case, but you get the idea. Looking at the entire watch itself and all the components, they just couldn't bring it up to the spec that they felt comfortable touching the watch, so they send it back. Unbelievable, right? Now, that's not even talking about the case part. Imagine you need a crown for the watch, that you lose the crown. They're not doing it because, once again, they look at the total summation, the total creation, all the parts together. It has to meet their spec, and if one of those things don't meet their spec, they're not just going to do the other thing, right? Oh, you want a crystal, the crystal's damaged, they can't get the crystal, but maybe they do have the parts. They're not going to do that for you because that's sending a watch back to you in a poorer spec than they are comfortable with. And so we're seeing a lot more of this coming from collectors that'll buy, a $10,000, $20,000 watch, send it in for service, and just receiving a flat out, no, we can't help you here. Watches as recent as produced or sold in 1990. Now, giving you one example of what you can do, right? there are some things that you can do besides send the watch into the Rolex service center. The first thing you can do is, let's say you need a crystal. There are many companies that produce aftermarket crystals, but let's say you want the best plastic crystal. One guy named Greg from True Dome has almost seemingly made it his life mission to create the best one-to-one vintage Rolex plastic crystals. And he started with some of the Submariner models. You can check them out. I haven't used them in any of my watches, but I know many others that have, including dealers. They love what he does at True Dome. But there are other places you can buy some of these parts. StarTime makes some of the movement parts. Now I'll say, yes, many of you out there, if you're familiar with watch service and vintage watches, you may have hunted for some of these parts on eBay, on Chrono24. They exist. The genuine parts, they float around out there, but you have to hunt. Not all service centers, not Rolex service centers, they're not going to hunt for the part on eBay for you, I'll tell you that. But let's say you send the watch to an aftermarket shop, they're not going to hunt for the parts. It's so much time finding the part. People put the parts up, they're mislabeled, and not to mention, vintage Rolex parts are very expensive because vintage Rolex, depending on the desirability of that particular model, have really climbed in price. So just setting aside the hunt, the prices are very high. So many people have started to settle for these aftermarket parts. Now, I wouldn't recommend putting an aftermarket part into an ultra desirable and collectible watch, but very soon that might be what you have to do, right? Because if Rolex is not going to service the watch, they don't produce the parts anymore, there's really a gap in the market there, and companies are starting to fill that gap, but unfortunately the parts are aftermarket because Rolex drew the line in the sand of where they were willing to actually service the watches. You know, it's kind of an interesting thing where, you know, they say we need these watches to be the absolute best spec, manufacturer spec coming back from you, but at the same time, you know, we're going to stop producing the parts. And this is to be understandable. And I think other brands are probably guilty of this. It's just, you know, when you're in the hot seat like Rolex is, you're going to get the heat, right? You're number one, people come at you. If you're number five, well, people probably not going to come at you, and it's not at scale, so it's not seemingly as big of a deal, and there's probably less casual buyers of something like a Blancpain as opposed to something of a Rolex where there's so many casual buyers that really don't know the things we're on here on YouTube and in the comments and on Instagram just talking about watches all of the time. So casual buyers, I think, are going to start realizing this a lot sooner, and unfortunately we're going to see a lot of vintage Rolex watches start floating around with aftermarket parts. Now, in my head as I think about this, I don't know what this is going to do necessarily to the market. Up until recently, this has been shunned, this has been looked down upon, watches with aftermarket parts. We don't do anything like that. Everything is manufacturer spec at Delray Watch, and most of the industry is manufacturer spec, but when the parts are not available, what can you do? You can hunt, you can stock up, you can hoard. Many watch dealers out there have stocked up in hoarded parts. Hans, our watchmaker, has a decent cache of parts, but millions of Rolex watches exist. They all use pretty much similar parts. It's only going to be a matter of time before it truly is not possible to find the parts. And if you do, it's going to be a barn find, and it's going to be something like $3,000 or $5,000 US for something like a crown that was used on a 1980s Oyster Perpetual, a watch that, you know, was the most entry level and widely spread watch, something like that. So these are the times we're getting into, but I'm curious to see where this really goes. I wanted to share this with you because I'm shocked at how uncommon this conversation is, at how few people are talking about this, and this is hitting people with Rolex watches that are produced as recent as 1990. People are starting to feel this, and when you can no longer buy a Rolex watch in the store, you hunt for them on the secondhand market, you find it, you pay even the premium price, and then you find out you can't service the watch with Rolex. So it's an interesting predicament that we're in. Personally, I'm not changing anything about the way that I have Rolex in my collection. I have vintage Rolex in my collection. I love my 1016. I wear it all the time. Usually my daily wear is a Rolex Oyster Perpetual 39, so I don't really have a problem with that either. And genuinely, I don't have a huge problem with Rolex stopping producing parts, because I think it's unreasonable that they produce parts forever. Maybe they just draw the line back a little bit further, or give a little bit more time, or perhaps work with a third-party contract manufacturer that makes authorized OEM parts instead of kind of letting the community itself piece things together and figure out on our own. It might be interesting if Rolex they've never done anything like this, and I can't imagine them doing this, but I think it's a fair solution for them to, maybe just find a factory and give them the contract, give them the schematics and say, hey, produce these parts, we won't even take a cut. And they just say, hey, this is someone that you can go to work aftermarket. I know, for example, I had a particular, I don't want to say collectible, but almost collectible vehicle, and the dealership just didn't work on it because it was a little bit older, and they sent me to, a shop that specialized in these parts, and they were able to work on it, no problem. And it had, OEM parts that were not authorized, but they sent you in the right place. And I think that would be very interesting and cool, for example, if Rolex did that. But what do you guys think? First of all, have any of you experienced this? Have you sent a watch into Rolex and were a little bit surprised? You were expecting a large bill, and you're like, yeah, I'll pay it, but you were receiving a refusal instead? Or perhaps you find a really great watchmaker that works on the Rolex watches. I would love to hear it in the comments below, but also your thoughts on this. Do you think Rolex is justified? Do you understand? Do you get their perspective? Or maybe you have a great solution to what they should do? Genuinely curious, please leave that in the comments below. And once again, this is not me in any way saying I hate Rolex, because as you can see, I really like a lot of their watches. I just think that as collectors, we're in an interesting position here with a brand that's really not focused on enthusiasts and collectors. And, maybe they're taking that stand, but that's their choice, right? What do you guys think? Comments below. Please do not forget the thumbs up, like, and subscribe. I really do appreciate it. And guys, please all have a great weekend out there. We'll see you next time. You've been chatting with John P. Ciao.